to today's Journal Club presentation. I'm your host Fatima Ibrahim from the Children's Nursing Development Unit. I'm excited to share findings from a groundbreaking South African study that examined preoperative fasting practices in children. This research from Cape Town's very own Red Cross War Memorial's Children's Hospital provides crucial insights for pediatric nurses across Africa about how you can improve your care for the youngest patients. By the end of this journal club, you will understand current evidence-based fasting guidelines, recognize the significant gap between recommended and actual fasting times in African settings, identify 4 key factors that contribute to excessive fasting, and learn practical strategies to improve fasting practices in your own clinical setting. Most importantly, you'll understand why this matters for the children we care for every day. So this study was the first to examine pediatric preoperative fasting practices in South Africa, and it was one of the largest studies of its kind within the whole continent. It reflects the realities of our healthcare systems, where it aimed to spotlight the current fasting practices of children before anesthesia for elective procedures at Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital, as a first step to improving the quality of care that we provide. Now let's examine just how robust the study was conducted. The researchers used a prospective observational design over 7 weeks at the hospital in Cape Town. They studied 721 children of all ages and health status classifications who were undergoing elective procedures. What makes the study particularly strong in their methodology is that they conducted face-to-face interviews with the parents immediately before the anesthesia, using standardized data collection forms, and provided translation services when they were needed. The study included both inpatients and outpatients across a wide range of surgical specialties. Their data analysis was comprehensive, using both Excel and the SPSS statistical software with age subgroup analysis and multiple statistical tests, including Kruskal-Wallis and the chi-square tests. All results included 95% confidence levels, demonstrating scientific rigor that makes these findings both reliable and applicable to our practice. See what this evidence tells us. The American Society of Anesthesiologists guidelines, which are followed internationally, including here in Africa, recommend specific fasting times based on what the child last consumed. Clear liquids should be stopped 2 hours before anesthesia, and breast milk 4 hours before. And then both formula milk and solid foods should be stopped 6 hours before surgery. These guidelines were developed to balance 2 very important goals: preventing aspiration during surgery while minimizing the harmful effects of prolonged fasting. So let's see what this study revealed. And the results became truly concerning. Instead of the recommended 2-hour fast for clear liquids, children were fasting for an average of 8 hours. That's 4 times longer than is necessary. And only 25.5% of the children met the acceptable fasting guidelines. This means that nearly 3 out of 4 children were subjected to unnecessarily prolonged fasting. For other intake types, the results were equally troubling. Breast milk fasting averaged 7.1 hours instead of 4. Formula milk 8.8 hours instead of 6. And solids nearly 14 hours instead of 6. These findings show that excessive fasting is not just occasional, it's the norm. So what we know is that extended fasting isn't just uncomfortable, it's harmful. The study authors emphasize that prolonged fasting causes significant physiological and psychological problems. Children develop hypoglycemia, which can be dangerous, especially in very young children. They become dehydrated, anxious, and irritable. Parents report increased sadness and behavioral difficulties. The research shows that children under 36 months are particularly vulnerable to these complications. And what's more concerning is that these problems are entirely preventable. Extended fasting provides no safety benefits, only harm. So the researchers identified four main reasons why children fast too long. Firstly, inadequate fasting instructions. This accounted for nearly 30% of prolonged fasting cases. Parents weren't told that they could give clear liquids on the morning of the surgery, or they received conflicting information. And secondly, poor adherence to instruction was the biggest factor, affecting nearly half of the prolonged fasting cases. So sometimes children were asleep when liquids were offered, and sometimes they refused, and sometimes staff or parents simply didn't follow the guidelines. Thirdly, contributed to about 11% of the cases. Procedures starting late due to paperwork issues, previous cases running long, or emergency interruptions all delayed and prolonged the fasting. Finally, what the researchers called provisional fasting. That was about keeping children fasted unnecessarily to maintain the theatre schedule flexibility, even when it wasn't needed. One encouraging finding was that the compliance was much better in babies under 12 months, with nearly 43% meeting the fasting guidelines compared to only about 22% in the older children. So this suggests that staff might be more cautious with our youngest patients, recognizing their vulnerability. However, even in this best performing group, more than half of the babies were still fasted too long. So this pattern really shows us we need targeted interventions for all the age groups, but particularly for toddlers and older children. You might be left wondering that isn't longer fasting safer? The evidence says no. In this study of 721 children, there were only 7 regurgitating events and 0 aspirations, even in the children who were fasted for shorter periods. And international research consistently shows that in healthy children, the risk of aspiration is very low, and complications from clear liquid aspirations are even rarer. The study reinforces that reducing clear liquid fasting times is safe and improves patient care without causing theatre disruptions. Since this study was published, international pediatric anesthesia societies have moved towards even more liberal fasting guidelines. So in 2018, major organizations recommended that healthy children can receive clear liquids up to 1 hour before anesthesia. And this approach has been successfully implemented in other centers, with studies showing up to 53% absolute improvements in compliance. The 1 hour protocol provides greater flexibility for theatre scheduling while significantly reducing unnecessary fasting time. And this evidence-based approach could really transform care in African hospitals where theatre delays are very common. As pediatric nurses in Africa, you play a crucial role in implementing better fasting practices. You're often the primary educators for families, the ones monitoring fasting status, and the advocates ensuring children receive appropriate care. This study shows that many of the barriers to optimal fasting, which are inadequate instructions, communication challenges, and system inflexibility, are areas where nursing intervention can make a real difference. We can provide clear, culturally appropriate education to families, ensure accurate documentation for last intake times, and advocate within your healthcare teams for evidence-based fasting policies. So here's how you can start improving fasting practices immediately. Firstly, review your institution's current fasting policies. Are they based on current evidence? Secondly, develop clear, simple education materials for parents in appropriate languages. Thirdly, implement reminder systems. Phone calls or text messages the night before surgery have proven very effective. And finally, establish monitoring systems to track the fasting times and measure improvement over time. Remember that the researchers emphasize that improving fasting practices requires a multidisciplinary team approach. So let me leave you with 3 key takeaways. Excessive preoperative fasting is a widespread problem that causes real harm to children, but it's entirely preventable. Simple, evidence-based interventions can dramatically improve compliance and patient outcomes. And as pediatric nurses, you have the knowledge, the skills, and the patient relationships necessary to lead these improvements in your own settings. I encourage you to discuss these findings with your colleagues and consider how you might implement evidence-based fasting practices in your own clinical areas. Answer these questions together. What are the current fasting practices in your unit? What barriers might you face in implementing any changes? And how could you overcome those? And how can you advocate for these evidence-based policies? Together, you can ensure that children across Africa receive the best possible preoperative care. Thank you for your attention to this important patient safety issue and for joining us today. Be sure to join us next month again for another exciting journal club. Goodbye.